Welcome to the Human Subjects Committee workshop. In this workshop, we will review the Human Subjects Committee application process, how to complete the Human Subjects Committee application, and we will also go over supplementary documents related to the Human Subjects Committee application. First, we'll need to visit the University of St. Thomas School of Education Action Research Resources website. To get to this website, begin at the University of St. Thomas homepage, then click on the Library link, and click on Research. Next, click Use the Research Guides under Help with Research. And select Education. The Action Research Resources Guide is the first link under Education. And this is a general website that deals with action research in the School of Education, but we're interested in the Human Subjects Committee tab. As you can see, this webpage contains lots and lots of information about completing the Human Subjects Committee process. We will begin with the document labeled Action Research Process Flowchart. This flowchart illustrates the steps in the Human Subjects Committee application process. You will first submit your Human Subjects Committee application to your professor. Your professor will review the application to ensure that it is complete and accurate. If any revisions are needed, your professor will return the application to you, indicating which revisions are necessary, and you should make those revisions right away and send it back to your professor. Once your professor is satisfied with the application, your professor will submit the document to IRB-Net, which is our new online submission portal. You will also be asked to register as a user in IRB-Net so that you can make changes to your documents as necessary and so that you can receive all communication from the Human Subjects Committee. After your professor submits the application, the Human Subjects Committee representatives will review the application to make sure that it's complete, and if your study is considered exempt, meaning it does not require review by the full Human Subjects Committee, then the application will be approved and you and your professor will receive an email. If any revisions are needed, then you will receive an email about this, and we ask that you complete revisions within 5 business days to ensure the timely processing of your application. Once your application has been approved, from the point of view of the University of St. Thomas, you are ready to start your research. However, as we will discuss later, you'll also need permission from either your campus principal or from a district authority, depending on which school district or school setting you work in. If your study is not considered exempt, perhaps because you are doing more of a psychological study or because you're studying more sensitive topics, then your application will go to the full Human Subjects Committee for review. This does not mean that your application will not be approved. It just means that it might take a little bit more time and you might be required to submit some additional information. The website of the Human Subjects Committee on the Action Research Resources page does have information about the different categories of research: exempt, expedited, and non-exempt. So please review this information if you have additional questions. Now let's turn to the application itself. You will see that there are some instructions for completing the HSC application, so please be sure to review that document. But we'll go over the application in a good deal of detail right now. So we'll click on the link, and you'll notice that a PDF file opens. It's very important that you have the most recent version of Adobe Reader, which is a free software, on your computer. Note that many Mac computers do not automatically have Adobe software, and a Mac will open a PDF file with a program called Preview. Please do not use Preview to open this document, as you will not be able to save changes and view changes easily. We do request that you open and that you download Adobe Reader so that you can work with this fillable PDF. The first page of the application is a cover page. You are the principal investigator, so you will fill out your information here, your name, your department, which is education, your telephone number, and an email address that you regularly check. Generally, you will leave this second section blank because most educational projects do not have a co-investigator. Then you will include the title of your study. Note that studies really should be 12 main words or less in accordance with APA style. And you will put the date that you fill out the form as the approval period start date. So for example, if you complete the application on October 20th, 2013, you would put October 20th, 2013 in this box. The end date is 1 year later, so October 20th, 2014. Your faculty sponsor is your professor, your research professor, and the department is still education, and you can include the phone number and email address that your faculty member or your research professor has included on the syllabus. The second page of the application is a screening form. Please respond to all of the items as they relate to your study. In the first item, you are asked whether your research will be conducted in an established or commonly accepted educational setting, like a school, university, college, etc. If you are conducting research at the school where you work, then you would click yes. The second question asks whether your research involves normal educational practices, things like instructional strategies, classroom management methods, etc. So click the circle that applies to your study. The next item asks whether research involves review of archival information. Archival information is information or data that already exist. So for example, if you were looking at last year's test scores or a child's previous records, then you would click yes, you are looking at archival information. However, there are several options for accessing archival information. In the first option, if you have legal access to this information, you should click yes. And note that legal access means that you have a legal right to look at the information due to your role and responsibilities in your school setting. So for example, a classroom teacher has a legal right to look at her students' grades. On the other hand, if you do not have legal access to the information, for example, if you're interested in looking at the test scores of an entire school or even an entire grade level, including students who are not your own students, then you have a couple of options. You can either obtain that information with consent from the participants and or their parents. Note that if you are obtaining information about children who are 17 or younger, then you do need parental permission. Or if somebody who has legal access, like your campus principal or associate principal or a testing coordinator, will be giving you this information, the archival data, without any student names or other identifying information, then you would click this option. And finally, if you're not using archival data at all, you would click no. The next item is often a point of confusion. It asks whether research participation is completely anonymous, meaning that the participants' identities are unknown to you. An example of anonymous participation would be if you send out an email to all teachers in the Houston Independent School District and included a link to an online survey, and then the people who responded to the survey, of course, would not put their names on it, and you have no idea who has responded to the survey. That is anonymous participation. In most cases, however, you might know who the participants are, but either not know which results are whose, or you would know which results are whose. For example, if you send a survey out to all of your students' parents, you know who those parents are, but you might not know which parents said what on the survey if you didn't ask them to put their names on the survey. So in that case, participants' responses are anonymous, but their participation is not. On the other hand, completely non-anonymous participation would involve looking at your own students' grades. Obviously, you know who the students are and you know which students are receiving which grades. The next item on the screening page involves the issue of minimal risk. Minimal risk means that any harm or discomfort due to the study is no greater than what would be expected in daily life or during the course of routine physical or psychological examination or tests. Typically, this involves any kind of classroom practices or even asking questions about beliefs or feelings about non-sensitive topics. So if you're doing a study that involves no risk or only minimal risk, a slight possibility that some people might become a little uncomfortable, then you would click no risk or only minimal risk. On the other hand, if you're doing a study that involves things like invasive procedures, surveys or interviews about sensitive topics, intense physical exertion, medication or device studies, or implementation of psychological interventions like counseling or therapy, then you would click the study involves more than minimal risk. And note that sensitive topics include but are not limited to issues like sexual matters, drug or alcohol use, illegal behavior, suicide, violence, mental illness, and abuse and neglect. Note that research on these topics is not forbidden, but if you are doing research that involves more than minimal risk and or that focuses on sensitive topics, then your research will be examined by the entire Human Subjects Committee. The final item on this page focuses on who will be in your study. These categories are considered to be vulnerable populations. And when vulnerable populations are used in research, the Human Subjects Committee just pays close attention to that. Again, these are not forbidden categories of participants, but the Human Subjects Committee will just take a close look to ensure that the participants' safety is being protected. Relevant categories might include children, people with mental illness or disabilities, or people who are economically or socially disadvantaged. Note that this pregnant women category only applies if you are doing a study on pregnancy. So for example, if you're sending a survey to teachers and there's the possibility that a few of them might be pregnant, you would not need to click this box. Now let's continue to the next page, where you will describe the details of your study. We won't go over all of these categories or all of these items in depth, because most of them are fairly self-explanatory, but I will point out a few places where sometimes people encounter pitfalls. In the first box, you'll need to state the purpose of your study, and you will notice that to the left of the box is an example of how to complete the box with regard to a specific type of study. So for example, the purpose of this study is to determine if having a medical professional as a parent is related to a student's decision to study nursing. You'll describe the participants briefly and state the approximate number of participants. You'll also indicate whether you have authority over any of the participants. For instance, if you're a classroom teacher and you're studying your students, you do have authority over your students. Again, it's not forbidden to study people over whom you have authority, but we'll want to make sure that you are taking the appropriate steps to make sure that they are participating of their own free will. You'll describe the specific data that you'll be collecting from or about the participants. And as we discussed before, if the data include archival data, existing records, you'll need to describe those records and explain how you will obtain the data. You can just indicate NA if you're not using archival data, and NA can go in any box that does not apply to your study. So for example, test data will be provided in de-identified form by the testing coordinator, or as the classroom instructor, I have access to my students' grades for the current school year. Next, if the data include information gathered from surveys, interviews, questionnaires, observation, basically any kind of measure, then you'll need to describe those measures here. And if you're creating your own instrument, like a survey or a questionnaire or a test or interview questions, you will need to submit a document with a draft of those questions or the survey along with your application. One thing to note is that it's important to keep the amount of text just to the box. In other words, if you've typed so much that a scroll bar appears on the right-hand side, you've typed too much. All the information should be visible without having to scroll down. And that's especially important because if the application is printed out, we'll only be able to see what is in the box without scrolling. These are not expandable text boxes. On the next page, you'll describe your recruitment procedures, so how you're going to get people into your study. And one of the most typical examples of this would be participants are students in my class, no special recruitment procedures are needed. But if you are having to recruit participants, you'll need to describe how you're going to do that. And then you'll describe the study procedures, including any interventions you'll be providing, if participants are assigned to group, what those groups are, any kind of experimental manipulations, how long participants will be involved in the study, etc. And there's an example of a summary of the procedures. You'll also need to indicate the time period the data collection covers. Now this next box really should not apply to most studies. If you are using any deception in your study, you'll need to explain that here and describe debriefing procedures, but I will note that we generally recommend that deception not be used in educational research. Deception would involve, for example, telling students that you're going to do one thing and then actually doing something else. Risks that participants face can include physical, psychological, social, legal, spiritual, and moral risks, among others. Again, if there are no risks involved or if there's only minimal risk, you'll need to indicate that here. But if there is more than minimal risk, you'll need to describe what that risk is. So, for example, although unlikely, it is possible that participants may become distressed by answering questions about self-esteem. Now note, if participants are under your authority, please describe how you will ensure that they are not being coerced into participating. For instance, although participants are my students, they will only be receiving standard educational practices and will not be asked to do anything else. Or, participants will be informed that they are free to refuse to participate without penalty and that participation will be anonymous. If there are risks involved, please describe the safeguards in place to minimize risks and to address any harm that might come to participants while participating in the study. This is especially important if you have more than minimal risk. So for example, if you're interviewing a student about something related to mental illness, there is the possibility that the student could become distressed, in which case you would plan, for instance, to escort the student to the school counselor's office for additional support. One thing I will note is that you should only describe safeguards that you have already cleared with the people who will be involved. So if you plan to involve your school counselor as a safeguard, you'll need to speak with the school counselor to make sure that that's okay. You'll also describe the benefits that the research may offer to participants, and if no benefit is expected, explain how the knowledge gained through the research is commensurate with the risks of the research. So for example, although no direct benefit to participants is expected, the risk of harm is extremely low, and the value of the knowledge gained through studying the relationship between student personality and college retention, which would be the topic of the study, would be extremely beneficial for improving college retention. In this case, if participants are filling out questionnaires about their personality, chances are there's very little benefit to them in doing so, although there may be if they are part of a workshop or something like that. However, understanding the relationship between personality and college retention could potentially benefit society on the broader scale, but the institution more specifically. If you're offering any incentives or compensation, please describe those here and make sure that they are not excessive. And if you have any assistants working with you, you'll need to describe what access they will have to the data. You'll describe any special training that you need as the investigator. And you will describe how you will maintain confidentiality of the data. And there are lots of examples of how to keep your data secure and protected. You'll describe how data will be treated at the end of the study. And note that the language that's used here is pretty standard, so you're more than welcome to copy and paste this language into the box. And finally, you'll need to describe what permission from another institution, either your school campus or your school district, is required. You'll indicate what the name of the institution is, so for example, your school district name or your school's name, to whom you've submitted the request, such as the principal or the district representative, and the date on which you submitted the request. Now note that some school districts will not look at an application for permission to conduct research until Human Subjects Committee approval is granted. So if that's the case, you might state, permission from, for instance, Houston Independent School District will be requested upon receipt of approval from the Human Subjects Committee. And finally, the last box rarely applies, but if you are going to benefit financially from the research that you are doing, then you would need to describe how you will benefit to ensure that there is no conflict of interest. The last component on this page is a checklist indicating which type of informed consent, if any, you are going to be using, and note that more than one box can be checked if more than one box applies to your study. And you will also check which kind of measures you're going to be using and which ones you have attached. So for example, if you're developing a questionnaire or a survey, you'll click this box. If you're doing interview questions, you'll click this box. But on the other hand, if you're using a measure that is under copyright, for example, the STAR test, the WAIS-4, the BDI-2, you would not need to attach a copy of that measure because it would not be legal to do so. And you can note that those measures are under copyright. Let's take a look at some of the other materials on the Human Subjects Committee website. You will note that there are several English language consent forms along with guidelines for informed consent. So I recommend that you talk to your professor about what type, if any, of consent is needed, and also review the guidelines to ensure that you understand the legal and other circumstances that might dictate a particular type of informed consent. There are several PDFs, and we'll click on one as an example. Here's an adult consent form. You'll note that you'll fill out the information relevant to your study as though you were talking to or writing to the participant. So the purpose of the study should be explained in language that participants can understand with minimal jargon. Procedures for the participants should describe what participants will be asked to do. Expected duration will be how long they will be involved in the research. For example, if they're filling out a questionnaire that takes 20 minutes, expected duration is 20 minutes. On the other hand, if they're participants in an ongoing program that lasts 6 weeks, expected duration would be 6 weeks. You'll briefly describe the risks of participating and how you will safeguard participants, as well as any benefits of participation. And if there are no benefits or no risks, you'll simply state that. And if there's any type of compensation, you'll describe that here. Please do fill out all of the boxes, and if something does not apply, you can either write NA or this does not apply, or for example, no benefits are anticipated. Note that there is some language at the bottom of the form that is standard. You won't change this information because it applies to all studies, and that includes confidentiality of the data, voluntary participation, how data will be used, as well as the investigator's right to withdraw participants. And you'll fill out your own contact information as well as your research professor's information. You will submit, if you are using informed consent form, you will submit a copy of this consent form with all of those pieces filled out. However, you will not submit a signed version. So you shouldn't obtain signatures from your participants until you have Human Subjects Committee approval. Once you have approval and you're conducting your study, you can obtain participant signatures and then keep those signed consent forms in a locked file or a protected file for as long as you're keeping your data. And you would also sign the consent form as well. And it's helpful to give a copy of the consent form to participants. Note that there is a consent form for adult participants. There is a permission form for parents to give permission for their children to be in a study. There's an assent form, which is basically a consent form for minors who are not legally able to give consent. And then there's also an anonymous informed consent statement. And this is for studies in which you want to describe the procedures and the rights, participants' rights to participants, but you don't want to obtain their signature because that would compromise anonymity. So this looks very much like the adult consent form, but there's no place for the participant to sign. And there's a statement at the bottom that by continuing on to the survey or the study, then the participant is giving permission to have data used in the research. Note that 3 of these are also available in Spanish language as Word documents. Currently, the anonymous informed consent statement is not yet available, but we hope that it will be soon. So if you need this, please contact me and I will work with you to adapt the adult consent form into the anonymous consent form. And you can see that in this Word document, there are places where there is bracketed text that is a description or instructions to you about what needs to go there. So you would need to type to remove that bracket and type in Spanish of course, the information that is relevant to that particular piece. So the reason for the study is, you would type in Spanish what the reason for the study is. Please be sure to remove any bracketed text because, again, those are instructions to you as the person completing the consent form rather than instructions to the participant. On the Human Subjects Committee webpage, there is a sample completed Human Subjects Committee application. So you can see that it includes the application itself, an adult informed consent form, an anonymous consent statement, as well as some sample interview questions and sample questionnaire items. This would be an example of a complete package that would be submitted to your research professor. And there's also a reminder that any instruments that you are developing or that you're going to be using that are not copyrighted need to be submitted as an attachment. Also on this website is a recording of a previous Human Subjects Committee workshop. There's the link to get an update to Adobe Reader, and there are some additional guidelines for completing the Human Subjects Committee application. As I mentioned earlier, once you have received approval from the University of St. Thomas, you are considered good to go from the university's viewpoint. However, you will also need to obtain permission from someone who is in the setting where you're going to be conducting your research to conduct the research. To determine what permission is needed for your setting, click on the District Research Requirements tab. You will find many school districts and other types of school settings listed here, along with the instructions for that particular setting. So you'll notice, for example, that some school districts require district-level approval, and there's an application or a link to the application underneath that district's title. In contrast, some districts and other school settings only require campus permission. So, for example, permission from the campus principal. So you'll actually need to start this process sooner rather than later. Have a conversation with your campus principal or the head of your campus and discuss what might be necessary. And then be sure to start the application process for your district as soon as you can so that you can get permission prior to the end of the semester. Once you have permission from your campus or district, as well as from the University of St. Thomas, you are ready to start your research. And one additional piece of information that might be useful is that under the Student Resources tab, there is a permission letter and form. This can also be found in Blackboard, and this is the letter or form that you will need to turn in by Learning Module 14 of this semester. The first page of this form contains a letter from me as the research director explaining the importance of action research in the University of St. Thomas's Masters of Education program. And the second page is for you to fill out. You'll put in your own name, email address, your research professor's name and email address, the title of your project, and a brief description of the project. Then you will ask the principal or your district authority to include his or her name and signature, as well as email address and phone number. Please note that if your district requires district-level permission, and they send you a form letter indicating that you've been approved, you may substitute that form letter for this form whenever you submit this in Blackboard. This concludes the formal presentation. Please let the presenter know if you have any questions. You're also welcome to contact me, Catherine Barber, at barbercr@sttom.edu if you need individual consultation about your project. But be sure to also speak with your research professor about any questions that you have related to the Human Subjects Committee application process. Thank you.